safe. Know your neighborhood, know your area, and the places you frequently travel. Understand evacuation routes and where water could cross roadways. And always have your 3-day emergency kit prepared. The city of Fayetteville has flooding awareness resources now available at fayetteville.nc.gov/flood. Learn more and get tips for how you can stay safe at fayetteville.nc.gov/flood.
Catch the vision, join the team. This is Pastor Carl E. Brinkley Jr., and I am pleased to be a member of the Wake Up Pastors Coalition. God has given us a powerful vision for positive change in our country and in our community, and the vision is already becoming reality. Please allow me to encourage you to catch the vision and join the team. There's a place for you in this coalition. We need your input and your insight. Let's come together because we are truly better together. Catch the vision, join the team, join the Wake Up team today.
Thou God of our weary youth, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on our way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray.
You are listening to the Grow Your Business Today program with your host, executive business coach and trainer, Darswell Rogers. Do you have a question or comment for Darswell or today's guest? Call 910-483-6111.
And good morning on this Friday. We're talking about August 5th. You've reached WID Wake Up and the Grow Your Business Today program, and I'm your host, Darswell Rogers. Listen to us across the We Do Radio network. And I'm so pleased this morning to have a guest on Zoom, and you can catch me on my Facebook page with Mr. Juan Powell. He is a longtime friend of mine, fraternity brother, Howard grad, all that kind of good stuff. And he's the regional vice president of the Community Builders. And so we're going to spend some time talking about his life, his career, and about the affordable housing business. And so with that, Juan, welcome to the program.
Hey, good morning, Darswell. Pleasure to be here.
So I love with folks who have had success in their careers to give our listeners an opportunity to get to know a little bit about them. It's fairly common for us to talk about the successes in life, but as we go through this day, I'd love to also have an opportunity to talk about a few of those frustrations or the challenges that you had to overcome along the way, because sometimes what I find is that when we only hear about how we succeeded, people think, well, that's different, that in fact that they had some sort of, I'll call it, charmed life or perspective, but in reality, we've all had those challenges that have in effect made us stronger for the future. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to open up the floor and give you the opportunity to share with the audience a little bit about who Juan Powell is.
Thank you, Darswell. And pleasure to be here. And so I'm at this point a longtime real estate developer. I work with an organization called the Community Builders. It's a large national nonprofit affordable housing developer. And really my first really time working in the nonprofit sector. I've spent really all of my career with for-profit. And so I've moved throughout my career, started out actually doing construction with a large DC-based general contractor, and then ultimately moved into real estate development, where I've been for really the last 25 to 30 years. And so really a very long time as a real estate developer, just working in a lot of different spaces. Started off doing office, moved into multifamily, both condos and rental and affordable, and now really primarily focused on affordable and mixed income multifamily developments.
I'm curious. I know that you were a civil engineer coming out of school, correct?
Yes.
So was engineering an aspiration kind of, how did you even come to the decision? And I'm going to tell a little story about myself. I thought an engineer when I was growing up was the guy who drove the train. So I didn't really even understand what an engineer was. So when did you get the engineering bug?
And so, it's for me, it really started in high school. Very, very strong, in math and sciences. And so you kind of get pushed into this technical area. And the more I looked into civil engineering, I thought the job prospects were excellent. Relatively speaking to some other undergraduate majors, the starting salaries seemed to be fairly favorable. And so it was just trying to figure out kind of the match of where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And it seemed to me that some of the other engineering types ended out in plants and, mechanical and chemical, and a lot of these plants were in non-urban areas. And what I liked about civil engineering is that civil is very urban in a lot of sense. It's out in non-area, rural areas as well. But anywhere there's building, be it, streets, highways, bridges, office buildings, hospitals, any type of building product has civil engineers involved. And so I thought that really positioned me to work in an urban area, which is where I wanted to be. And so that helped me to really pick civil. And it was also a little bit more tangible for me. The building product, you could physically see your work. And for me, just for example, electrical engineering, where you're dealing with electrons and moving currents, and that was a little bit something a little bit harder for me to kind of grasp conceptually versus building. So civil was what I picked, and really glad I did. I've just even as a real estate developer now, I still rely on just the civil engineering education all the time.
So I'm going to ask a basic question about civil engineering. What is it about the word civil that translates into building? What's I've wondered that, because electrical is clear to me, mechanical is clear. How is civil buildings? What's the match there? What's the connection?
Yeah, I think it probably had to go back to civil meaning public good. And a lot of civil works were really infrastructure. There's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure dollars now with the ARPA funds from being approved at the federal level. And so I really think that civil works really were this infrastructure civil good. And we've really moved that from, bridges, dams, infrastructure, airport, into just the true building industry.
As you were talking, what actually crossed my mind was that civil could be short for civilization, but that may be completely.
Let's go with that, man. Let's go with that. We help civilize the world.
You help us. Hey, in the absence of something else, at least you can throw it in there as one of the possible scenarios. I
like that. I like that.
So you're doing today affordable housing.
Yes.
And you're doing it for an organization called the Community Builders. So let's talk a little bit about who they are and where you all are doing your work.
So the Community Builders is a 50-plus-year-old organization, really started in Boston. And currently we have a regional model that we use with different offices in different regions that cover various footprints. And so, and those being the Northeast, which is Boston, Connecticut. Then we have a New York office that does New York and Jersey. The Mid-Atlantic office is really split into two components. I have a peer that manages DC and Maryland, and I oversee North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. We also have two offices in the Midwest that cover that region also. And so, we're in 15 states and the District of Columbia. A lot of our work is affordable. Some of it is market rate, and a lot of it really now is mixed income housing. So it's a combination of both affordable housing plus market rate rental, really integrated into one community, which really is really a growing model across the country.
So within the context of that model, and you have at least, I'm aware of one development you have in North Carolina. Do you have more than one?
So one, and we're really in Durham as well as in Charlotte. And so we've been in Durham for about over 15 years and have, around 225 units in Durham. And in Charlotte, we have one existing building that's on a site that has 48 units. And then the other part of the site, which is under construction, will add 233 more units. And so the first phase of that really should be finished by the end of this year, with the second phase, second quarter of next year. And so, North Carolina is an important area for us, and the needs are very strong there.
You see yourself, you all doing more stuff in the Carolinas?
Yes, it's, North Carolina is really much like the rest of the nation. I was looking at something recently that said, just kind of as background, one of the thresholds for people in affordable housing is very low income people, and those are individuals where their incomes are about 30% of what's called the area median income. So in a place like Fayetteville, let's just say the area median income for a family of four is somewhere around $55,000. And so someone who is making 30% of that, which would be around $18,000, would be called a very low income person. And for people who hit that threshold nationally, there's about a 7 million units of housing shortage nationally. And I was looking at something in preparation for our conversation today, that just within the state of North Carolina, that shortage is over 200,000 homes. And so if we're adding, if nothing else changed and we were able to get to 10,000 units a year, it would still take us 20 years. And that's if no one else gets added and we don't lose any existing affordable, which is happening all the time. And so North Carolina is a state that's, very similar to others. And the demographics also flow very similar, that Black people are disproportionately, low income and very low income in the state of North Carolina. And so that when you look at this shortage of affordable housing in the state, Black people are disproportionately impacted by that shortage. Mm-hmm. And so the organizations like ours, in the state and elsewhere, have just really committed ourselves to this battle, and it remains formidable to try to create.
We're talking to Juan Powell. He's the regional vice president for the Community Builders. They're a nonprofit that builds affordable housing in 15 states, and Juan in particular happens to have North Carolina within his within the sphere of his focus.
Yeah.
When you in reading some of the material on your website, there's a statement that you all kind of make up front that is that it's the power of home.
Yes.
And I guess this notion that homes create strong communities. Can you speak a little bit to that philosophy and the thinking there?
Sure. And I think it has probably two contexts. One is that at the individual level, for those of us who have housing stability, we just, at the end of our day, we go home. And it's a given. We're not concerned about whether we're going to be evicted, whether we're going to be homeless, whether, what's going on. But there's a large percentage of, the country that faces housing instability, that they don't know where they're going to live 3 months from now or a year from now. And the impact of that on families, on children, when you're moving, changing schools, changing friends, changing social dynamics, is really destabilizing. And you talk with a lot of people and they say, well, I grew up in the same community all my life, or we moved once as a child. And you have families that are caught in this cycle of housing instability, where they're moving once, twice, 3 times, a year or in a few years. And so it's devastating. And it's devastating on the children, the parents, the extended family. You just lose that housing structure. And so the power of home, it's really important, because until a person has housing stability, you're not going to do well in school. You're not going to have good health care. You're not going to have relationships that should be. And so we start with that at the individual level. But then it's bigger than that, in the sense that a lot of the places that we work are really emerging communities. Some of them are what we call communities of opportunity, which are strong, stable environments. But a lot of these communities are ones that have suffered from segregated past, been victims of redlining, been victims of urban renewal, where freeways and highways were erected through the Black communities, which destabilized these communities and put them into a downward spiral. And so a lot of these places, and they're in pretty much all major cities with significant Black populations across the country. You can find these same events that have transpired, whether it's Baltimore or Pittsburgh or Detroit. And so one of the things that we do, and again with others, is we go in, and once you start to invest in these communities and start to bring resources, then the homes that are created encourage other homes, which start to stabilize the community. Then the retailers come, then the for sale homes come, then the market rate housing comes. And so it's really a catalytic process to go into a community and start to work and redevelop it. But that's a lot of what we do, is by creating new homes in a lot of these emerging communities. It really does become catalytic for future growth.
One of the interesting things that I was exposed to, having lived 24 years in New York City, where density has been and affordable housing has been a challenge for decades upon decades,
right?
Was new development tended to what the city would do, and it might have been the state and the city, they would develop strategies because developers obviously are driven to make a profit,
Right.
to allow them to create some market rate product, so long as they would intermix into the development some affordable.
Right.
And there was, there was a strategy, if you go back, I don't know if it's to the 50s or the 60s, and I'm going to speak to New York, and hopefully you could extrapolate this into a broader perspective, where they would create low-income housing by itself.
Mhm.
And those would turn into wastelands at some level, right? Because,
Right.
and they said, you know what, this notion of putting all the people who are low income in together just breeds a mindset that's not productive. If we intermix people with low income in communities with people with I'll call it average or even high incomes, the dynamics of the community elevates. In other words, you don't operate with the lowest common denominator if you're a low income person, if you see examples every single day of people who are in effect operating in a prosperous way. And so in New York, the apartments would be exactly the same, but you would be in a market rate unit, and literally across the hall there'd be an affordable unit. Is that the kind of strategy? First off, to what extent have you seen that be a strategy going forward? How much more effective is it versus just straight affordable? And just give me your general perspective or perceptions on the strategy in terms of not just building affordable, but lifting people that are at a lower income in terms of striving for something better economically.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on, Darswell, that it's an inclusive structure. And so, for example, there's, and this recently happened in Pittsburgh, where the mayor, Gainey, has encouraged inclusive zoning. And so basically what that does is if you're a developer and you're building 100-unit building, that you're encouraged to build, let's call it 120-unit building within the zoning or within some kind of financing structure. And so that 20 of those units are affordable units, and they're mixed in with a market rate. And it's a really encouragement to market rate developers to add more affordable units. And those mixes can be anything depending on the project. It could be 80-20 market to affordable, and it could be 80-20 affordable to market. And the other technique, which we also advocate for, is even if you don't have a building that has both market rate and affordable, what we need is communities that have both market rate and affordable. And so that you're in one nice, clean, safe building that maybe is all market rate, and I'm in one nice, clean building that's all affordable, but we're all in this community together. There's employment opportunities, there's access to recreation, there's access to transportation. And so the real challenges of the past have really occurred when we had, just high densities of low income housing, affordable housing. A lot of this became public housing that was really concentrated.
Right.
And so then you just lose a lot of opportunities.
So we're going to take a break here at the bottom of the hour and come back. We're talking to Mr. Juan Powell, Regional Vice President of the Community Builders. You're listening to WID Wake Up.
You are listening to the Grow Your Business Today program with your host, executive business coach and trainer, Darswell Rogers. Do you have a question or comment for Darswell or today's guest? Call 910-483-6111.
And welcome back to the second half hour of the Grow Your Business Today program. Again, I'm your host, Darswell Rogers. I'm pleased to have as my guest today, Mr. Juan Powell. He's the Regional Vice President of the Community Builders. They're a nonprofit that does affordable construction in 15 states, and Juan happens to have North Carolina in that mix. Let me take a step back and ask you about the community builders, the organization. You said it'd been around for about 50 years. Exactly how does it get its funding as a nonprofit to do the work that it's involved in?
Yeah, that's a great question, Darswell. You know, one of the real challenges to affordable housing, and it really is the reason why there's such a shortage, is that it's really hard to get funding to do the projects. And so just as a parallel, that if someone wants to build, again, I'm going to use a 100 unit apartment building, they would typically, through their own investment capital or with relationships with others, they would generate, 25% of the cost from their own cash. They would get bank debt for 75%, and they would build the building. And then the cash flow from the property becomes a return to the investment capital. And it really is a good model, and it encourages the growth of market rate rental housing. The challenge with affordable is that affordable housing does not generate the levels of returns. So it really is not able to attract conventional equity, because there's no returns to that equity, because the rents are so low that in some cases these are half or even a third of what the rents would be for a market rate. And so the whole affordable housing industry is driven off low-income housing tax credits from the federal government. And so that each state is able to issue a certain amount of low-income housing tax credits each year. And those are divvied up. And in a state such as North Carolina, these go to rural areas, they go to urban areas, they're really spread across the state. And it really is challenging to get these low-income housing tax credits. And so that really becomes one of the major constraints. And then the second part of it is that even if you get these credits, the property can only support a certain amount of debt. And so we have what we call in the industry gap. And so that really is the difference between the low-income housing tax credit equity, the debt we can support. And so that gap is what developers such as myself, we spend a lot of time trying to really just get the capital outline in place to build a project. And so it's really a tough system. It's the only system we have in this country now that's really in place. And it's really challenging. It's really hard. When I did market rate office development, getting a project financed could take 60 days. And it's like that now for for deals that make sense for a market rate rental. To get a deal financed and affordable could take 2 years. I mean, anywhere from 1 to 2 years between applying for money, getting gaps, and getting that project closed. And so it's really slow, really painful, and it's really tough. And so it really constrains the output on affordable housing. And so we absolutely need new models in the industry to try to create more.
So I always like to, I followed that pretty well, but I always like to see if we can, so that the general audience is going to be able to wrap their minds around
Sure.
where the challenge is.
Yes.
So the federal government provides tax credits. Let's start there. So the federal government provides tax credits. How does a tax credit work in terms of doing a financing? What are we really dealing with?
And so basically, if we want to think about it as an individual, let's say that an individual made $50,000 a year and had a $10,000 tax liability because of that. And so that if someone came to that person and said that, look, if you invest some dollars in this area, let's say if you invest $1,000 in this area, your tax liability will reduce by $1,500. And so, and because it would have to be close, in order to get an inducement, the deal would have to be more favorable than what would happen otherwise. And so what happens with the investors, there are tax credits, but there are also tax benefits. Again, just to use the homeowner or individual, you get tax breaks for interest on your home. And so that the investor in properties get tax advantages from being an investor, and those are combined with the tax credits to produce a net benefit for that investor that induces them to make that investment. And so it's really the losses from being depreciation, which you're well aware of, but
Yep.
if you the depreciation of the property combined with tax losses, combined with tax credits, produces an inducement for individual organizations and banks and firms to invest in the tax credits for that tax benefit.
So what I would say is people who make a lot of profit, be they individuals or companies, they make a lot of profit and therefore they're going to owe taxes to the federal government.
Yes.
They're given the opportunity to invest in an affordable housing project.
Yes.
And instead of giving the money to the Internal Revenue Service, if they invest in, let's say, an affordable housing project, not only will that money go toward that project, but they're going to give them an additional inducement that even makes it more advantageous, because if it's the same, well, I can pay my tax or I can do affordable housing, I might just pay my taxes. But if I'm going to get a little extra juice,
right,
and presumably while the return is not as good, there is some return, I guess, back to those investors for doing affordable housing, correct?
Yes. And so it's not a cash return in the sense of a market rate developer who's getting returns on their cash. And so really what the investor is getting really is just, these tax advantages. And then there's also certain inducements that are in place to encourage banks, to invest in certain areas, to invest in affordable housing. And so like most industries, it's relatively complicated, a lot of players, a lot of moving parts, but the challenges and the constraints are really the drivers. That it's just every state only has a certain amount of these credits, and to divvy out within the state, and so it only produces X amount of housing.
So we're living in a country today where tent cities have become prevalent. There's actually, I just found out recently, and maybe I've been in a tunnel or something, that there's actually a tent city here in Fayetteville.
Wow.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily think about that. I mean, obviously, LA is notorious for its tent cities, and I'm assuming that all this plays together. This lack of affordable housing, people choosing to live in tents. There's a connection between those two.
Right. Yeah. Very much so.
I had a conversation with a mutual friend of ours out in California who told me a story just in the last week about an opportunity that to have bought some buildings several years ago for $6 million that it wasn't a transaction that he was in a position to do, but he was talking to the person who owned them. And so there was an inducement for them to put up an 8-story building, mixed use, whatever. And that the state was going to provide, there was something like my numbers may not be exactly perfect here, but the construction was going to be over $100 million, and the state was going to give a grant of $25 million.
Wow.
On the construction. And so you talked about there being a gap,
Yes.
right? You get tax inducements, and then you've got this gap.
Yes.
And so in my mind, when you said gap, I'm saying to myself, okay, so in that scenario, the state filled the gap. Is that
That's
a
right.
private?
Yes,
So-
that's exactly.
So what would be a typical way that a gap would be filled? I mean, that's one example, a literally grant to an investor to do something. But how else do you all fill a gap like that?
And so it's a few different ways. And so a lot of it starts with the federal government. And so the federal government has a number of programs such as housing trust funds. And so these trust funds are given, from the federal government to jurisdictions. And so there are state trust funds, there are city trust funds. And so what happens really is two different pathways. The states make funds available at the state level, and then the cities and counties make funds available at the city level. And they're funded from a lot of different sources. For example, in the District of Columbia, there's some percentage of transfer taxes. I sell a building to you, I pay taxes to the district. Some percentage of those taxes goes into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so that's would be an example of local funds being available, but all of the states that we work in also make funds available for affordable housing. And the real challenge is that some states are much more aggressive in funding and other states aren't. And I don't know, the District of Columbia, the funds have, really spiraled over the last several years. And I imagine they're up over, $200 million a year for affordable housing. But you have other cities where the needs are similar, where the local jurisdiction can only allocate $10 million. And so depending on the health and prosperity of the city, and depending upon the will of the elected officials at the city level, county level, either the state level, really determines the prioritization. One of the challenges in North Carolina is the issue of rural versus urban. And it happens at the legislative level. And so that, you could have a model that said that 50% of all funds go to urban areas or 50% go to rural areas. And if the populations were equivalent, that would kind of make sense. But if they're not similar and the needs are so much greater, then what happens is affordable housing becomes far more challenging in urban areas than it does in rural areas, despite at face value equal treatment of both.
And are you saying that's the situation here in North Carolina, that we've got this split where you want as much in the rural area, but there's just not as much of a demand or need in the rural area?
Well, and it's even more than that. The things evolve, and I will say that. But what happens is that in order to be awarded funds, you have to apply, and there's criteria for scoring on these applications. And so it's just like anything else. Very few applications for anything are totally neutral. And even if there's the intent. And sometimes you end up intentionally and sometimes non-intentionally with outcomes that favor one area or another. And again, I think there's been progress on this in North Carolina, but historically it's been much more challenging to get the appropriate mix of dollars into urban areas.
So we've got about 7 minutes left here. I'm talking to Mr. Juan Powell. He's the regional vice president for the Community Builders. They're a nonprofit that builds affordable housing. They've got projects here in North Carolina, in Durham, and Charlotte. I'm curious, thinking very selfishly. So here I am in Fayetteville, North Carolina. What kind of basic criteria or environment do you all typically look at to decide that it's a marketplace that you'd like to enter?
The number one criteria, if let's say we wanted to enter into a project in Fayetteville, is political will. That the leaders of the community, elected, non-elected, stakeholders, say, hey, we've got a problem. We want more affordable housing in this community. How can we do it? How can we find the right partner to help us navigate through this? And willing to make a long-term commitment, because it takes a long time to do a series of projects. And so you really have to build a machine, if you will, that can start to execute over a long run, not just do one 50-unit project and call it a day. And so we like for there to be political support and community support, for that when we go into an area. Then the other side, obviously, is economic support. Is there a pathway to get the resources that it would take to make projects a reality, which often goes back to the local elected officials as well as the state officials to see if there's a pathway to get the resources.
As I reflect on it, and there have been several affordable housing developments in our community in the time that I've been here.
Great.
What is interesting is, and I'm going to call it a thought process or a mindset of people. The developments that I'm visualizing right now are all single story. They might be probably attached. Some of them are detached.
Yes.
But no real density, right?
Okay. Yeah.
The culture here is my take on the culture is, if I live someplace, I'm supposed to have a yard.
You're right.
But if you were to go, and I guess I don't want to get too technical with everybody, but it seems to me that I'm using all that land to put up this amount of houses. If I were to go up 1 or 2 stories, I could put so much more housing on the land. But if that might be a lot more expensive to go up. And I'm just curious, because when you begin to think about how do we solve this development, and I literally now recall that somebody said, but people don't want to live there, so therefore you're going to have a hard, and which I don't think would be the case. Now people just want a nice place to live. Right. Is there something to be said for, in a marketplace like Fayetteville, where everything is really one story, or at least there's not 2 people on top of each other, to consider higher density to get more affordable housing in place?
It is. I mean, that's one of the things that we're doing in Richmond, and we just started a new project in Pittsburgh. That's the same way, that you can create density in 2-story structures where, they look like, single townhomes, not like the row houses in Philly or DC, but they are kind of a townhome, and there may be 2 or 3 together that are connected, and then you get to another, 2 or 3. And so it's really a combination of low density, but and a higher density model. And yes, it's much, place like in these communities where we have 3-story buildings with higher density, much more cost effective to build, much more. And a place like North Carolina, where we're talking about the application process, it's really challenging if your construction costs start to get high. So you have to build really cheaply in North Carolina in order to get funded. So you need an efficient approach. And certainly doing even a 3-story building would be more cost effective than these individuals or even townhomes that are much lower density.
Well, I have gotten a good education this morning. Is there, you got like 60 seconds here. You got anything you want to add here at the very end?
Well, I would just encourage everyone to be cognizant of the affordable housing challenges that we have in this country. It impacts, may not impact given listeners, but it impacts people in your community. And so affordable housing makes for healthy communities. We all need to be in this together. It's the best way for really us to advance as a community. So I would just advocate awareness and support for affordable housing initiatives.
Mr. Juan Powell, first off, thank you, brother, for agreeing to spend some time with me this morning. I really appreciated it. And we hope you have an outstanding weekend and look forward to catching up with you down the road.
Okay, thanks for the invitation.
And to my audience, have an outstanding weekend. We'll see you next week. You're listening to WID Wake Up.
Your station for inspiration and information.